Okay, so I've been thinking about some different ways to set up the gearbox for the Kyosho Rampage Pro and Outlaw Rampage Pro for the electric conversion. So if you go back and watch the build series for my Rampage Pro E electric conversion, I talk about how I set up the gearbox for that particular build and how I use the stock input shaft that came in with that gearbox, and how I had to cut down little channels on the back of the diff hub to move that, the slipper hub, my bad, in order to move the slipper hub close enough to the gearbox so that the spur gear is in close enough proximity to mate with a pinion gear on the motor mount that was designed for this gearbox by my friend. Now this is one way to do it. But as I play around with different gearboxes from different kits, I find that sometimes the stock input shaft doesn't always mesh too well with the gears, and even if I have fresh gears for the differential. So I tried playing around with the input shaft for the SST gearbox for the Pro X and Pro XRT, and it is noteworthy that the internals of that gearbox, which looks like this, that's your rear motor gearbox, is different from the internals for the Rampage Pro and Rampage Pro E, even though they're both SST transmissions. So all of the parts that go into this gearbox here for the Pro X and Pro XRT have a smaller part number. So it's part number SST 7 for the input shaft, SST 5 for the diff gears, and I think SST 4, 8 or something like that for these final gears here. But for this gearbox, the input shaft I think is SST 35, the diff gears are SST 33, and the output gears are SST 34. So different part number because the output gears are a larger diameter, and the diff gears are also a larger diameter in this gearbox than they are in this gearbox. And even though the input gear has the same number of teeth between these two gearboxes, the design is a little bit different in that for this gearbox, the input gear has an extra extension here on the end that the other one doesn't have. Okay, this is from the Pro X gearbox. And also the pin placement for the slipper hub is further out than it is for the Pro X input shaft. Now the thing is, when I was using this input shaft as originally designed for this gearbox on my Rampage Pro E build, because this pin is pushed further out, I had to Dremel these little channels or recesses deeper into the slipper hub to sort of recenter everything. But I figured that if I used the Pro X input shaft, then I have a pin placement that's closer to the gearbox, and I don't have to make that kind of modification on the back of the slipper hub, so I could use the stock slipper hub with these kind of shallow channels here, and it would slot right in. And to a first order, this seems to work okay. The only thing is, because there's not that extra extension at the end of this input shaft, like there is here, you can see the first extension of, I think this is 7 nanometer diameter, and there's a 5 millimeter diameter additional extension here. This 5 millimeter part mates into the 5x10 bearing that normally goes into this housing here. So I figured, okay, well, I need something to basically pick up the slack or the space in the gearbox. So what I did is, instead of putting a 5x10 in here, I put in a 7x11, because the 11 millimeters is the diameter of the remaining part of the housing. The 10 millimeter outer diameter is just on the very end of the gearbox. Everything outside of that is 11 millimeters. So there's a 7x11x3, and that basically is just like a spacer that can run up against this end here of the input gear, so that it prevents this input shaft from pushing further inwards toward the end of the gearbox. Now, even though the inner diameter of this bearing is 7 millimeters, while the outer diameter of this extension is only 5 millimeters, you'd think that gives the input shaft a lot of wobble. But again, if you go back and look at some of the other things I did, videos I did to talk about modification to the SST gearbox, on this side of the input shaft, I actually have the 5x10 that goes into it and an additional 5x11 that's further inside. So you have a 5x10 and a 5x11, and so you have these two bearings that mate into the housing on this side, and that locks down the input shaft pretty well on this half of the gearbox. So you don't necessarily need a perfect bearing on the other side. I just need something to provide the appropriate kind of spacer, if you will, to prevent this input shaft from pushing in further inwards. So this is something you can do, and it does seem to work. I closed it up, it spins freely, it seems to work okay. If you want to use a Pro X or Pro XRT input shaft on this Rampage Pro or Rampage Pro E gearbox, in order to make it a little bit easier to do an electric conversion on a Rampage Pro or Rampage Pro E because of the placement of this pin that mates to the slipper hub. So this modification here with the 7x11 bearing here and the SST 7 or 7H input shaft from the Pro X gearbox, this allows you to not have to you know, Dremel out your slipper hub in order to do an electric conversion that can actually work and mate a pinion gear to a spur gear with the amount of shaft length you have on the motor that mounts to the motor mount. So I hope I've explained this well enough. So basically I'm doing an Outlaw Rampage Pro truck build, okay, basically a mid-motor truck, kind of like my Rampage Pro E buggy. And so for this particular gearbox, I'm going to use this specific type of input shaft option, and because I was really just having trouble with this input shaft meshing nicely with these gears, and so rather than fiddle around with this, I just went to this one. It seems to work better. So give it a try. If you're looking to do an electric conversion, this is probably actually a better option than what I did on my Rampage Pro E buggy. I just kind of got lucky with that gearbox. Everything seemed to mesh together okay. But this is probably a much easier way to do the conversion if you don't want to do any dremeling. Okay, so I just want to go over that relatively briefly. And in the meantime, thanks for watching.